Have you ever wondered if there's any downsides to only having a legislative session for 120 days every 2 years? Well, we're about to find out. This week on Battle Born Bytes, we're going to find out why every person inside that building is so goddamn stressed right now. From Battle Born Progress, this is Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's boogie. Real legislative heads know that today is called Sine Die. Why is that? So every day the legislature adjourns. Duh, tell me something I didn't know. But at the end it adjourns Sine Die, Latin for without a day, because literally they're not gonna come back tomorrow. Isn't that quaint? For anyone into your books, it's the have a great summer of the legislative session. That's all well and good, but why is everyone so stressed? Well, it's because every single bill is getting its T's crossed and I's dotted literally right now, as we speak, because Sine Die is today. Over the last 119 days, 63 legislators have introduced over 1,200 bills, not including a couple dozen that carried over from last session. That's objectively a lot of bills. But only a fraction of them are going to become law. And as much as that is about the content of the bills, and it is mostly about the content of the bills, it's also about the process. How is the sausage made? It's not pretty. Just to lay this out, the normal process is that a bill gets introduced, that's the first reading on the floor, then gets assigned to a committee where it gets an initial hearing and then eventually a vote through something called a work session where it's either amended or voted through, sometimes with recommendation, sometimes without recommendation. More on that later. Then it goes back to the chamber floor from where it was introduced. This is for something called a second reading, and this is where things start getting frantic. So, if a bill's going to cost money, then it gets re-referred to a money committee. This is Senate Finance or Assembly Ways and Means. You may have heard these words before. There, the money committees decide if they think it's worth spending the money and then advance the bill again. Now, if you didn't have money attached, then you're lucky. Now you get to go to a big list in the sky called General File, where maybe you'll get a vote. If you're unlucky, then you go to a purgatory called the clerk's desk. Exciting. If your bill just got put on the clerk's desk, congratulations. Your bill has become a legislative football. It's because someone shook a stick at your bill because they had enough power to shake a stick, and now you need to get them to unshake the stick. That's probably usually an amendment, and sometimes it's just a trade, like you're negotiating and say like, oh, you have power to do something and I have power to do something, so I'll give you this if I give you that. This is called log rolling in the biz. I don't think anyone really calls it log rolling anymore, but I like the visual of rolling logs. Let's roll logs. The last option, though, is that your bill actually never leaves the clerk's desk and it's dead forever. This actually happens a lot of ways because it could never leave committee. It could never leave the floor. It could die in a million ways, and usually not dying in an active way. People rarely vote down a bill. The things don't get votes if they're not going to move. What happens instead is we just ignore them until they're dead. And I'm not going to think about that too hard. I'm not going to think about my own mortality because of that. I guess I should have started all of this as live stream. If you really love democracy, you can just watch any bill hearing. Get in there. It's sicko hour in there.
Sicko hour in there.
And that's not even the crazy part, because the crazy part is the stuff you can't see. Let me tell you about a little thing called a behind the bar committee. Say you've got a committee and say a bill has been introduced in an emergency way where it abides by no law of time or space. This is when they just go on the floor and the cameras are not on and they say this committee is meeting behind the bar. Then a flood of lobbyists and journalists all run inside the floors to try and listen from a distance to what's happening, because there's no microphones. They're literally just handing each other like little papers, and they're like, hey, there's this giant like 800-page bill we just got. Everyone please review. Let's vote on it right now. And they vote for it now, and everyone leaves, and it's very awkward. But none of that exists on the internet. It's as if it happened, but it didn't happen. There's a bit in Attack of the Clones, Star Wars Episode 2, when they're like, Camino should be here on the star charts, but it isn't. And they're like, if it's not there, it doesn't exist. But it does exist. That's a behind the bar committee. I'm glad I found an analogy for that. And with all that said and done, we are now approaching midnight on Sine Die, which is usually when the thorniest bills finally happen. That's when everyone crosses their fingers, sends stuff off to the governor, and hopes that he signs all the budget bills, because if he doesn't, that triggers a special session, and then we can't go home. And things are not over. By the time you watch this video, we'll know, and Jacob from the future will appear with voiceover and let you know. Jacob from the present, signing off. All right, back in the quote-unquote studio for this one, because what a day! What a day happens after you turn off the camera on Sine Die. So in practice, the amount of negotiating combined with the pretty strict 120-day time limit and cavalcade of deadlines means that with about 4 weeks to go, things start piling up like a cartoon train crash. So this is also, coincidentally, when we get a flood of budget and appropriation bills because budgets start closing and the state is finally able to finalize how much money it thinks it's going to have over the next 2-year budget cycle. And those finance committees, man, those finance committees.
Good evening. This is truly Finance After Dark. It's like 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?
All right, so what's it all look like? Let's take a look at AB 238. That is the film tax credit bill. I'm sure you may have heard of it. For anyone who needs a refresher, that was the bill that would have given about $1.4 billion in tax credits to movie studios for a movie studio in Summerlin, which is in the ritzy part of West Las Vegas. It was a whole thing. AB 238, though, was actually fairly controversial, not the least of which because a pair of studies commissioned by the Governor's Office of Economic Development found that the fiscal impact would be that the state made back like 50 cents on every dollar it invested into film tax, which is not a great return on investment. But to set the scene, we had a push and pull between advocates who said that this would create a new industry that could diversify Nevada's economy, and critics who said that's a pretty bad return on investment. But I digress, because this bill kind of starts mostly normal. So after it floated around in 2023, film tax credits as an idea comes back in early 2025 and gets an initial hearing in February. By legislative standards, this is basically immediately. But everyone acknowledges that this would cost a lot of money, and so it doesn't actually go anywhere for a while, as budget committees actually start rolling up into the end of the legislative session. So, AB 238 finally moves out of its policy committee, Assembly Revenue, in early April, but it does so, quote-unquote, without recommendation. That is what it sounds like, and potentially a sign that there are issues behind the scenes over getting enough support to get this thing over the finish line. Days later, the bill gets its second reading and gets re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means, the Money Committee, because again, it's going to cost a boatload of money. Crucially, these secondary hearings at the Ways and Means Committee are happening after the state's economic forum. For the uninitiated, that is a panel of economists that basically tells the state you're going to have this many dollars to work with over the next 2 years, we think. This year, that economic forum, not great. Honestly, I don't know if you've looked at the economic news, kind of all over the place, really. And so it reflected that. But I digress again because we're finally getting down to the wire. AB 238 makes it back to the floor on May 27th before getting stuffed on the chief clerk's desk. Remember what I said about that and what that means.
Your bills become a legislative football.
It's purgatory. And what's happening in the background here is people are whipping votes. People who want the bill to pass are trying to get it to pass, and they need to find out what they need to do that, and it's all over the place. Finally, on May 30th, again, when it wasn't clear that it would actually have the votes, it does eventually make it to the floor. And in, frankly, one of the more dramatic votes I've watched this year, no one was really sure if it was going to pass until the last second, when indeed it did, 22-20. And for you doing the math at home, if one vote had flipped the other way, that might have been enough to just do it in altogether. But then it goes to the Senate, and that's where things really go wild. Theoretically, it should have gone to the Senate Finance Committee, but one day before Sine Die, bills need to have their second hearing or else they just die automatically. And so it actually never gets that hearing. Instead, it gets withdrawn from Senate Finance in a procedural maneuver, just shoved straight onto the general file, where it's just gonna sit and incubate until they figure out what they want to do with it. And for everyone waiting to see what will happen, everyone's just kind of stuck on the sidelines. What are they doing with that bad boy, we all wonder? Who knows? Well, we would find out just a couple hours before Sine Die, because alerting nobody, they just uploaded an amendment online that removed the whole thing. They crossed out the whole bill and they wrote in, let's make it a study. Let's study the implications of film tax credits. We'll come back next time. Even then, they did not vote on this right away, because once that bill, AB 238, was on the general file in the Senate, where they vote on the thing, they were voting on other bills, and they kept kicking 238 to the next agenda, never quite voting on it. And with minutes, and I literally mean like 30 minutes to go before midnight on Sine Die, everything blew up. So look, I haven't been watching legislative sessions closely that long, but it has been like 10 years, which is horrifying to think about for me personally. And with that context, I can say confidently, they don't normally end like this. So real quickly, just to set the scene, the Senate is normally presided over by the lieutenant governor. It is one of like 3 jobs the lieutenant governor actually has. This is a Republican, Stavros Anthony. He is presiding over a Democratic Senate. Okay, we got that. So with like 30, 40 minutes to go, they recess, the lieutenant governor leaves for some reason, and then they resume, and the lieutenant governor is not there. Later, he would tweet that he got locked out, but I don't know how you get locked out. Like there's a guy standing at the door, and I feel like if you knocked on the door and said, "I'm the lieutenant governor, I should be running that meeting," he'll let you in. Everyone's like yelling at each other over who's running the meeting. Who's running the meeting? But ultimately that was just a little scuffle. We're finally back to business. Unless it turns out no one knows what's going on in the Senate because they start debating something called Senate Resolution 9. Ultimately, SR 9 would have made the makeup of the Legislative Commission and changed it based on who has control of the legislature. For obvious reasons, Republicans were upset about this. It was great if you're a fan of Robert's Rules of Order, though. I mean, we had calls of the question, we had divisions of the House, we had roll call votes and voice votes, and everyone was standing. People were just like standing up randomly and they were counting. It's like, there's like 5 senators standing. There only needs to be 2 senators standing. Who's standing? Was someone standing when they called for that motion? Then we top it all off because there's not like really a filibuster in the Nevada Senate, but we got one anyways. Republican Senator Ira Hansen just sort of managed to work the parliamentary rules to his favor such that he was able to finally make remarks.
And I think that it's wrong for us to now at the last minute attempt, in literally the last minutes of the Nevada, whatever session this is, it's almost midnight, my mind is going every which direction.
And then it was midnight, and it turns out that like by law, by like the Constitution, it's like, that's it. It's over. Everyone go home, pack it up.
The 83rd session of the Senate of the Legislature of the state of Nevada is adjourned. Sine die.
All that to say, a bunch of stuff never got voted on, including AB 238. Like a couple hundred bills did eventually make it to the governor's office, and he has started vetoing a bunch of them. We're going to have to wait and see how many of the bills that passed, didn't pass, or will get vetoed, or look, we got to wait a minute before we actually get the dust settling on this legislative session. But fear not, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a nice hearty mini breakdown of what happened at the legislative session and what it all means. Until then, for Battle Born Progress, this has been Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. We'll see you next time.